Seminar sitting out here for the next 3 hours on exactly what were the causes of the American Civil War, and depending on what part of the country you're from, there's obviously a different point of view on all this. But we can we'll boil it down and say basically it's the issue of slavery. We can argue about the economics of the United States and the fact that the South, which is basically an agricultural economy, is losing its political clout to the North, which is rapidly industrializing. We can talk about the fact that new states are coming into the Union, and with their arrival, whether they become slave states or free states, it's going to influence the politics. So all of this is going through the United States, but underneath all of this is still what this country will do with the issue of slavery. A fellow by the name of Abraham Lincoln runs for the presidency from the newly formed Republican Party, gets elected in 1860, and now in essence 11 southern states say, well, we've had it, we're leaving the Union, forming our own country, the Confederate States of America. So with the leaving of those 11 southern states, shots get fired at Fort Sumter in April of 1861. Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to now put down the rebellion of the South. The South calls for its own volunteers, and now we've got both sides forming volunteer armies, and they think they're going to be engaged in this grand and glorious campaign for a couple of months, march off, do a little bit of fighting, come home, show everybody our medals and our uniforms, and what they discover is this is going to be a long, protracted, and very nasty war that's going to kill more than 620,000 Americans before it's done, our most costly war ever, and it will go on for more than 4 years. Gettysburg will occur at the midpoint of that 4-year war. In the first 2 years of the war, the South does particularly well, particularly in the Eastern Theater, where they win most of the major battles. A fellow by the name of Robert E. Lee will take command of forces in the state of Virginia in 1862, rename those forces the Army of Northern Virginia, and again continue with this spectacular series of victories against his northern counterparts. The North seems to lose these battles, pull the army back, throw the commander out, look for somebody more aggressive, put them in charge, re-equip the army because they have the industrial wealth of the United States behind them, and send the army back into the field. Every time this happens, Southern forces under Lee look at the situation and say, you know, we just won the last battle, but we're losing the war because we don't have the men nor the resources to keep this up. Let's see if we can end the war as quickly as possible. So by 1863, Lee is thinking in terms of ending the war at this point by bringing the Confederate Army out of Virginia, moving them into northern territory. If he can seize a northern capital or northern city, that may end the war outright. If he can draw the Army of the Potomac north here, he can win a major victory on northern soil, and we're 8 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line at this point, then the political ramifications are such that he can get that treaty and maybe end the war, and the South can go about its own business as the Confederate States of America. And certainly, he's looking to gather supplies and materials up here. He starts the campaign in early June from Fredericksburg, Virginia, takes the Confederate Army and moves west into the Shenandoah Valley, and then starts to come up the present-day route of Interstate 81. As he starts to come up the Shenandoah Valley, he goes to his cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, and he basically says, listen, I want you to stay on this side of the Shenandoah Valley. Stay to the east. Tell me where the Union Army is at all times. As I move north, I'm going to make a stab at one of those northern capitals. I'm going to try and gather supplies and materials. You let me know where the Union Army is so that I can govern what I'm going to do. Stuart doesn't do a very good job of that. He gets trapped on the wrong side of the Union Army when the campaign starts. So instead of coming north with the army and hugging the mountains, he's riding around the eastern side of the Union Army, basically scaring everyone in the state of Maryland, scaring people in the state of Pennsylvania, but not really supplying the information to Robert E. Lee. Even without his cavalry, Lee really has no real opposition as he begins to move north into Pennsylvania. The Union Army under a guy by the name of Joe Hooker is very slow to come up here after him. Lee will arrive here the last week of June, being a good commander. He senses what's going on. He only has local militia basically as opposition, and so being about 25 miles to the west of us on the far side of the mountains near Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, Lee will now begin to disperse some forces, sending some of his Confederate forces north towards Carlisle, which is about 30 miles behind us. He's going to send part of his Confederate forces in Route 30 or the Chambersburg over the mountains through a little town called Cashtown, which sits right out there at the base of those hills to the right. He's going to send them in, and they will arrive in Gettysburg on the 26th of June. And these are Confederate forces under Jubal Early, a Virginian. They will be here a week before the battle. They'll ransom the town of Gettysburg for supplies and not get very much. They'll move next to York, Pennsylvania, which is about 25 miles further to the east of us. They'll go through York, Pennsylvania on the 27th, and by the 28th, they will be about another 20 miles to the east at the Susquehanna River, a little town called Wrightsville. Gettysburg as a town had a population of 2,390 people living here in 1863, which sounds like a backwater town until you realize that if you look at the 1860 census of the United States, we only had 19 cities that had more than 100,000 people in them. Washington, D.C. had a population of roughly 60,000 people, so this is a fairly normal-sized community. If you just look at the area, roads converge on this town very much like spokes coming into the hub of a wheel. And if you're maneuvering huge Civil War armies, we're talking about two armies at this point, the Army of Northern Virginia with about 75,000 men under the command of Robert E. Lee, and the Northern Army with about 90,000 men. And you always take numbers and times with this with a grain of salt because no one knows absolutely for sure. But about 90,000 men is the Army of the Potomac under George Gordon Meade, and you're maneuvering up here looking for each other. You're using these network of country roads to try and logistically move things around. It's the network of roads that will ultimately bring them here and have them bump into each other and then initially fight this action around here. If you look left here, you can see this silver-painted brick structure. If you look at the southern wall of it, you can see all the damage done to it by artillery and rifle fire during the three-day battle. There were Confederate soldiers in that building for a portion of the battle. There were Union soldiers back on Cemetery Hill, and they were shooting at each other, trying to drive those Confederate troops out of that building. So you see that damage, and a number of these buildings that remain today can show Civil War damage or evidence of the fighting that went on here in and around the town. The town ends up literally in the middle of the battle for the 3 days. If you lived in Gettysburg, you had a home, you were not in any danger of the Confederate Army because the Confederate Army is basically making war against the Union forces and attempting to capture a major northern capital and achieve a victory over the Union forces. They're not making war against the civilian population in 1863, not how we envision war today. Although that doesn't mean the northern residents were not in a panic over the invading Confederate Army here. And this is part of the battlefield. This is McPherson's Ridge. We're back into the park at this point, having come up through the town of Gettysburg. Have you seen the movie Ted Turner's Gettysburg?
Yes.
Okay, well, you know Sam Elliott plays John Buford, and Buford brings Union cavalry into Gettysburg and basically stakes out the ground and spots the Confederate Army in this area. Buford essentially came through the town of Gettysburg on the streets we were just on, probably on June 30th, much to the relief of the local townspeople who have had elements of the Confederate Army through this town for a week before the battle took place. You can also get a feel for where we are because now we're looking at a lot of monuments on the battlefield. Gettysburg has more than 1,360 monuments, markers, and tablets on this field, and we'll see a lot of them as we move around here. Kind of keep in mind the majority of these are going to be Union in nature because this is a northern state representing a northern victory. After the war is over, times are tough economically in the South, and so as a result of that, they're not real interested in coming up here and placing a lot of monuments on this field. Then in the start of the 1900s, renewed interest from the southern states, and you start to see them coming back. They'll place monuments, but they tend to be a little bit more generic in nature. You don't get those nice specific monuments with a lot of individual mention of officers or someone who did something special. It tends to honor everyone from the individual state, always with a few exceptions, and we'll talk about those here in a couple of seconds. Okay, if you're a baseball fan, this is Abner Doubleday. We had him on the battlefield. This monument honors him, placed by the state of New York. Doubleday will end up commanding Union forces on day one because his boss, a fellow by the name of John Fulton Reynolds, will fall mortally wounded from where that small marker stands back in the trees to our left front over there as the heavy fighting breaks out about 10 a.m. on July 1st. Reynolds giving orders to members of the Iron Brigade to move from our right to our left through this woodlot called the Herbst Woods at the time to drive back Alabama and Tennessee troops that are coming up from Willoughby Run further down here to our left. And I'm going to stop up here and kind of back up and kind of get things, and we're kind of throw a lot of this stuff as we're moving through here.